Hello, KCD, Pakistan. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Andy Grabner, and today I will be talking about observability and orchestration of your deployments, taming the operational complexity of GitOps with Keptn. So I will talk a lot about different CNCF projects today. Personally involved, I am mostly in Keptn, as you can see here on my head and also on my shirt. Keptn is a project that I've been part of for the last 4 years since we started the project. I'm also involved in Open Feature, in case you're interested in that. That's a great project too. It's kind of making it easier for developers to build in feature flags. It's kind of like trying to become a standard, like what OpenTelemetry did with observability. We try to become a standard with Open Feature and how you implement feature flags. And OpenTelemetry, of course, that's a big topic in observability. And you'll also see it in my demos. If you want to follow up with me, you can do it on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and so on and so forth. All right, let's get started. Keptn is a big topic, and I just want to highlight some of you I know are part of the Keptn community. So just to give a little bit of background, we started Keptn, as I said, in 2019. And we, since then, last year, we reached incubation status. That was really a great milestone after that many years. We now call Keptn, that graduated Keptn V1. It's a general purpose orchestration engine for cloud and non-cloud native tooling on Kubernetes. So really what Keptn V1 does, it connects all different types of tools that you're using in your tool chain, from your build, your test, your deployment, your notification tools, your monitoring tools, and it connects them all through an open standard and enables a more automated delivery and remediation based on observability data. So Keptn V1 always has observability in the center and then connects your different tools to execute sequences to make sure your deployments get into production safely with properly being tested and properly being evaluated. And then we also have a remediation use cases out there where we are taking a problem, let's say a Prometheus alert, detected a problem, and then we can execute sequences of tasks to bring the system back to a healthy state, which means we're calling your tools and we're always looking at observability data from whatever provider you have to see if the system got back to a healthy state. So this was our kind of journey so far with Keptn V1. And I want to say journey because the journey has quite changed recently. Now, why did it change? Because in the recent past, cloud native GitOps, as we see it, has shifted complexity more from dev to ops. Now, what do I mean with this? If you think about the classical monolithic world, many of you may still live in that world, right? The challenge was that many developers were working against a single Git repository of a monolithic app, working on different components that had dependencies, obviously, within that monolith. And so the first challenge was the complexity of the devs coordinating all of the work. And then we used great tools like Jenkins to really make sure that through continuous integration, continuous testing, building, also validating security, that we are actually building a component, a monolith that could then be brought over to operations, right? And operations then, I think, I call it simple. I know it was not simple, but it was, the days back then were simpler because they could deploy, observe, and operate a well-defined app that came out, because the complexity of what the app is was all in the kind of the monolithic repository. Also, there was more well-defined infrastructure, a VMware instance and EC2 and so on. Now, with the cloud native world, I think, and especially the emergence of GitOps and tools like Argo, we have seen a shift. It became much simpler for developers to work on their individual services because we are promoting a service-based, microservice-based architecture where every development team runs and builds and configures their own Git repository. And every time they have a change and push it, then Argo is then pushing it out to the target environment. And this is now where the complexity comes in, because what is not really specified in most cases is if you're deploying independently into environment, what's not defined is what is actually the app. Is the app these 5 services in a certain version, or is there maybe another flavor of the app with a different version of a certain service? Who is responsible for the individual tests as you start to deploy these different services together, right? As they come, as one service becomes 2, 3, 4, and essentially the app. So it's really hard to do and enforce all this because testing, security checks, validations are really not part of GitOps. GitOps just says, let's deploy this over into the environment. There's also many different flavors of Kubernetes, which makes it also complex, more complex for operations to really validate the health of an application, where everything is secure, everything is observable, and everything is orchestratable. So benefits for development, become more innovative, deploy faster, but I think more complex for the people that have to operate these apps. Now, we've also received that same feedback when more and more people were looking into what we built with Keptn V1. One of the feedbacks we received, we did a pretty good job with our SLO-based validation. So in case you have not seen Keptn yet, one of the things we've been doing pretty well, you can define a list of SLIs and SLOs, metrics that we're pulling out. And with that, we can validate if your overall deployment, whatever you've deployed, is actually healthy. And I think the key thing what we've learned here is single pod ready doesn't mean application ready, right? If you're deploying 2 pods, 2 different services, and they're all ready, doesn't mean that the app is ready. With Keptn V1, however, we gave you the option to specify metrics, response time, failure rate, combined it with tests that test the whole app, and then we could validate if everything works as expected. So this was a great justification for that use case. However, we also received things like it was really hard to integrate Keptn into all the different tools, especially if you have many organizations that are large, many development teams, and they may use different tools, not only Argo, but maybe they also use still Jenkins, they use some other tools, and you have to trigger Keptn from these pipelines. What they were really asking for is a zero integration approach. The other thing is with Keptn V1, we didn't configure Keptn. We didn't specify the SLIs and SLOs and the tasks and the stuff we executed through CRDs, not natively in Kubernetes, but we had our own config files with our own Git repo that was independent of the stuff where your application lived. And as many teams are adopting Argo, Flux, and others, right? The community told us, well, you're not really living in a GitOps world, right? This doesn't really fit into the GitOps model. Also, the next thing is we heard more and more from the community, especially as OpenTelemetry and Prometheus became more prominent players and kind of the de facto standard. They were saying, why don't you extract the data and then provide the results also in OpenTelemetry and in Prometheus? Because Keptn V1 actually uses our own internal way of storing the data and how we expose it through our own custom API. There's no integration with OpenTelemetry or Prometheus. And last but not least, Keptn V1 worked while we called it a service. We didn't have a concept of an application. But now, as I said earlier, more and more people are moving towards deploying multiple services and then trying to figure out how they can then validate the whole application deployment. There's a kind of workarounds with Keptn V1, but still, we didn't really have an application concept. We were not really application aware. And this is the feedback that we've received. There's some really good ideas in Keptn with the validation, but there's some things that really don't fit into the modern GitOps model. And so with this, we sat down and say, okay, what is the solution to solve the bigger problem here? And the solution that we came up with is that we needed to change Keptn. We needed to implement an operator that can observe and orchestrate application-aware workload lifecycles. So what does this mean? If you have an app, like in this case, with 3 services that can independently be deployed, because as I said earlier, every team may have their own Argo and then they just deploy, or their own Git repository in Argo, then just deploys every change. What we wanted to do and what we're doing now is we have an operator that leverages Kubernetes webhooks and extends the Kubernetes scheduler. So that means when a tool like Argo or any other tool, it doesn't have to be Argo, it can be Flux, you can even do a kubectl apply, it doesn't really matter. Whatever deploys a change into Kubernetes, a workload change, Keptn is now using the capabilities of Kubernetes to do pre and post deployment checks. That means we know before, we can hook into before a deployment actually happens, means before the Kubernetes scheduler actually schedules that pod, and we also know when the scheduling is done. So we have this information. That means, first of all, we can make it observable. We know when which workload is being deployed, and we can look at the metadata on the deployment itself, so we know which service and which version. So that's already great. we can create metrics, we can also create traces. How long does it take, right? So, but this is not all. We also introduce an application concept where you can now declaratively specify that these three services, front-end, back-end, and storage service, like in this case, belong to an application. And you can also give an application a version and can also specify which versions of the individual services belong to which application version. So we're bringing application awareness to it. And what we also do is our operator, when we detect a new version of a service, let's say the front-end service gets deployed with the version 2.1, then we would say, hey, there's a change to that application. So we are also able to measure and kind of provide a webhook for pre-app deployment. So we can do something before deployment, or we can measure when the deployment for the app starts. We then measure how long it takes for every changed workload. And then we can also do post-app deployment. That means we can also create metrics, but we also can extend the trace, meaning we can show a trace from the first component of an app being deployed until all of the components are deployed. Now, you may have wondered, what are these colors? Why is post in red and green and the other one in blue? Well, what we also introduced is not just creating metrics and traces for these events. We are also able to execute tasks and evaluations for pre and post deployment. So think about this. You can now in a declarative way specify that before an app gets deployed, you may want to validate that all the external dependencies are there, like an external database. Or you want to validate that the environment is even healthy. You want to make sure that you have all the approvals, or that you have enough error budget to deploy. And as part of a post-deployment action, you can see here some of those tasks that we see. Maybe execute some tests, do additional runtime security scans, or after deployment is successful, clean up whatever it is left over from the old version. Of course, also evaluate. Is the application running as expected? You meet all of your SLOs and so on. This is what we do. Now, how does this then look like in Keptn? I will show a live demo in a couple of minutes. We are introducing new CRDs, or actually extensions to CRDs. We're using the same CRDs that you already have, like your deployments. That means you can see here, we have annotations that start with Keptn SH, where you can basically say what type of version this is, to which application it belongs to, also which pre and post deployment tasks. You can specify your own tasks. So we have tasks, and we currently support the Dino runtime, where you can specify TypeScript. There's TypeScript code that then gets executed for you as part of a pre or post deployment task. Evaluations, similar here, you can specify your PromQL queries that should be executed, and then also an evaluation target. So we're validating that your metrics are as expected. And then application, this is optional. So if you have single service apps, then that's fine. But you can now also specify so-called Keptn app. And as I said earlier, you can specify which versions of which workloads belong to that app and what are the pre and post deployment tasks. Now, if you do all that, and you're doing, let's say, kubectl apply, or Argo is rolling a change out, then what we are doing, we are, as I said earlier, interjecting the Kubernetes scheduler, and then we are able, on the one side, to create traces. So this is where OpenTelemetry comes in. That means we're creating a trace for the end-to-end deployment of your app, which means you are seeing how long the app took to deploy. We also show you the pre-deployment, the pre-app tasks. If you have some specified, they will show up here, also how long they take. Then for every individual workload, if you have one service or multiple services, for every workload, we create a span that then also shows all the pre-workload tasks, the pre-workload evaluations, the deployment itself, so how long did it actually take Kubernetes to deploy, and then also the post workload tasks. And this would be then repeated for every single workload. And then at the end, you have your post app. So this is great tracing. So you see, how did the deployment actually happen? How long did it take? Where did it stop? Where did maybe Kubernetes take a long, long time? Which pre or post deployment tasks failed or succeed for whatever reason? What we also do is we are creating traces. Besides traces, we also do metrics. So Prometheus metrics, which means you can use whatever observability tool, any dashboarding tool, and you get some of these metrics. Especially, I talk a lot about DORA, the DevOps metrics. So you get most of the DORA metrics out of the box by just installing Keptn, because we are tracking how often you deploy, how many are successful, how many failed, how long they take, time between deployments, and so on. And for Argo users, what we have right now, we also have an extension where we are visualizing some of the Keptn tasks and CRDs that we are creating, because we are always, when we detect a new version, we're creating a CRD for that particular application version, and then you also see the individual tasks. All right, let's see. I'm 16 minutes in. I want to do a quick demo that you know this is not just all slideware. I have my Argo here, right? This is the stuff that I've shown you earlier. I have already a couple of builds deployed in the past, build 1, build 2, build 3, build 5, right? Also here, you get all of the details. I mean, and also the health status, so the application is obviously healthy in my case. Now, if you don't know Argo, that's fine, but essentially Argo is currently linked to my Git repository where I specified my app. Here, a couple of things. Actually, let me first trigger this and see if my demo works well. I'm just changing something here. So I'm simulating if I would be deploying a different app. I'm deploying, let's say, app version number 6, which means I'm deploying maybe one of my different services. And I say deploy v6. Here we go. Commit changes. What should happen now? If you know Argo or any other GitOps operator, it should realize that, hey, there's a new change in the Git repository. It's currently processing. It should figure out that out of sync, and now it starts deploying my new pods. So this will run a little bit. While this runs, I want to just show you a couple of more things. What else do I have in my Git repository? I've explained this earlier. I have in my deployment, actually, let's go back in here. I specified my pre-deployment evaluations. I want to do some evaluations before the deployment. I want to also call a notify task before and after, and I also want to do a post-deployment evaluation. So here, declaratively, I can say what type of tasks and evaluations do I want Keptn to do for me when this workload gets deployed. Now, where are these tasks and evaluations? I want to show this as well. Keptn tasks is in here. In my case, I have a task. I told you one way is you can write your own TypeScript inline here. You can also reference to that code in another file that you have somewhere in your Git repository. But that's all there. In this case, it is basically sending a Slack message. All right. So that means before and after the deployment, this code will be executed fully automatically, and it should send an evaluation. So it should send a notification. Evaluations, here are my evaluations. I have 2. I'm very easy just to show you. I have an evaluation deployment and evaluation dependencies. This is going to be called pre-deployment and this after. But here you could specify multiple queries with a target, and then Keptn Lifecycle Toolkit is evaluating all of this. What else do I have here that is interesting? The other stuff is just by default, the data provider. I'm using Prometheus here, so you need to specify how Keptn can actually communicate with Prometheus. We have the same also for other data providers. Now, let's see, what else do I have here? I have my Prometheus dashboard. I'm just looking at a longer time frame here. Over the time, I did a couple of deployments, so that's great. I see the metrics, Prometheus metrics. You can do whatever you want with it. I have also my traces here. So if I open up one of these traces that I ran earlier today, right, I see my Jaeger traces, or I see my distributed traces in Jaeger, just as I showed you earlier. Now, the beauty with this is all OpenTelemetry Prometheus. That means, I mean, in my day-to-day work, I work at Dynatrace, same metrics here in Dynatrace, same traces here in Dynatrace, or in Datadog, in New Relic, whatever other tool you have. All right. So let's have a quick look on how things are looking here. What's happening? Version number 602 is being deployed. Post-evaluation is done. Pre-evaluation, post, everything is done. Let's see if I have my Slack. Slack is here, 8:50 local time. That's just 2 minutes ago. I got messages sent over. So all of this works. All of this is here. I also get to see a couple of details on the individual instances that we have here. So you can fully explore all of the results of the evaluations if you are interested in. Right, like in this case, the query, the CPU capacity was 8. So this is all there, and it was meeting my criteria. What else can I show you? What else do we do here on the simple node? That's the Keptn instance. We're also generating a couple of events. So for the individual lifecycle events, we're creating Kubernetes events. That means any observability platform, you can also just ingest this and do whatever you want with it. It's all here, all fully automatic. Cool. That actually worked like a charm. So let me go back because I want to wrap it up. So where do we take this, or kind of an overview? Because I just showed a very simple example. The good news is, what we did is you take your observability tool. Observability is very important for us because we want to make better decisions with observability, and we are giving you observability into your deployments also through your observability tool. Keptn really extends your GitOps. That's the nice thing. So that means you install Keptn on your individual clusters. Then you're extending your CRDs to say, I want Keptn to take care of certain things. I want certain actions to be executed. I want Keptn to be aware of my application. And then when you are really committing your code changes, then whatever GitOps tool you use that is applying the changes to your Kubernetes cluster, we start with the pre-deployment checks. We also create the traces and the metrics. We then, based on that, allow Kubernetes to really deploy the pod yes or no. So we can really act as a gate here, as a gatekeeper. After the deployment is done, we can do the post checks. Now, if you think about this, we're currently working on this as well to propagate then the trace information. So one of the post actions could be to say, Keptn successfully validated that this deployment is good in dev. Now let's trigger the next Git workflow on the next environment. And then it just continues there. And our ultimate goal is obviously that we are doing an end-to-end trace from the first commit that enters your dev cluster all the way to the end. And we have all of the different capabilities to do pre and post deployment checks. We're also thinking about day 2 operations. So in case something runs already and then there's a problem, that we can also use Keptn Lifecycle Toolkit here for orchestrating day 2 operations to bring the system back to a healthy state. This was one of the use cases we already had with Keptn 1.0. All right. So this is our vision. We are getting there. We need some support and help, but really, right, in the end, to come back to my first slide where I said GitOps has shifted the complexity to operations, but GitOps is necessary and it's great that we have it because it made life easier for dev. Keptn, I think, will make life easier for dev and ops, what I showed you, right? So you declaratively define your applications and everything you want Keptn to do in Git. You use whatever tool you want, Argo, Flux, to deploy it. Keptn extends your GitOps deployment with test, security, validation, whatever you have. And we do this completely Kubernetes native on any flavor of your tooling that you have. Wow. Cool story. Cool project. I'm really proud to be part of it. I hope I could encourage some of you to look into Keptn, which means if you are interested in this, we go to keptn.sh, find us on Twitter, Keptn Project, and also try some of my examples that I have out there and our examples in general of the community. But with this, I want to say thank you so much for having me, for letting me spread the word about Keptn, and hopefully see you soon in real life at some point. And with this, bye-bye. Keep learning. Take the opportunity that you have here in connecting with such a great community. All right. Bye-bye.